I hope that you have had a good, maybe restful holidays. Rest feels like a bit of a luxury around the holidays. I hope maybe you've at least had a couple of mornings where you could rest. I know it's busy for some of us, and having lots of family, either at your house or going to families' homes, can be anything but restful, but it is indeed a potentially joyous time. So many of us don't get to see our family and friends as much as we would like. So I do hope some of that has been made available to you over the past couple of weeks. It was a great holiday for me in that regard, but I am still recovering a little bit from some of the running around. However, it is winter, and as I said on Sunday, if you feel like jumping into a new year, that's fine, you do you. I think I want to sit like the trees are right now and kind of wait for a little warmer weather. I'm going to continue to work, but I'm also going to try to avoid rushing. There's something about trying to achieve a frenetic pace in the middle of winter that doesn't seem right to me. So I will move as I can, and I urge you to do the same. Wherever Spirit leads and however Spirit is directing you, just follow that. This last Sunday, I spoke a little bit about how we are called to embrace and perhaps even be incarnations of the Creator. Incarnations, bearers of the divine image, the hands and feet of Christ. We read from Paul's letter to the fledgling community of the Colossians. We also read from the very famous prologue of John. And both of these texts can be a little tricky. The metaphysics might not be yours. However, if we imagine God, the figure in this text that changes, goes through alterations as we read the Bible, makes a decision to enter into the fullness of life, which means God experiences suffering, pain, joy, laughter, the range of emotions and experiences that you and I have. If we are willing to stake our lives and build our lives around that fundamental claim of the incarnation, what does that say, or what does that mean for us? How are we now supposed to live if God chose to live and be with us fully as human? Then what does that mean about our responsibilities in the world that we now inhabit? How are we called to incarnate that presence and practice of God where we are? We look around, we shudder at the violence, we feel it in our bones, the number of the unhoused here in our city, the violence at a global scale that has been happening, and sadly doesn't show signs of stopping. I wish that I could say it did, but I'm not here to give you false hope. What I am here to say is that in the midst of what you witness and I witness, we can and are invited to become something other than the prolonging or the perpetuation of this way of being and doing. These cycles of violence that get us nowhere but just into worse and worse forms of violence that destroy our communities, our families, our very sense of self. So the invitation from the Gospel of John and Paul's letter to the Colossians is in some ways simple. We are called to incarnate the love of God that was behind the decision to become fully human, to pour God's self out fully into creation. And the way that we do that, or I should say 4 ways that we can do that I tried to highlight a bit in my reflection, is love, stewardship, promise, and solidarity. Love, as it's understood within these gospel and epistolary writings, is not a sentiment, it's not a feeling, it is a commitment, a stubborn commitment, because you kind of have to be stubborn to keep loving the way you're called to love. in the face of a world that seems diametrically opposed to that call. So this kind of love, this outpouring, this kenotic love, is a way that the incarnation shows up in our communities and in our own lives. It's the way we become incarnations, not just to another person, but to entire communities and ultimately to creation, to all our relations. Secondly, I mentioned promise. Promise is the trust, the commitment, the orientation of the not yet. We know that we are called to do and be, and we have had a foretaste of what can happen when enough people come together around this promise, around this new way of being community, being a new family, children of God born in Christ. We know what can happen a little bit. And so promise is about committing ourselves more fully to that orientation, to that disposition, to that way of comporting ourselves in the world. We are not going to be encouraged to do it by many sources in our lives. And so we have to come here, we have to spend time with Creator, with the gifts that we've been given, and make that decision every single day. These are two ways incarnation shows up: love, promise. Thirdly, I would say solidarity. Solidarity is about the decision to identify with those who are suffering the most. It is probably, I don't know if I would call it the most difficult, but it is exceedingly difficult, because the thing we don't want to do is identify with pain and suffering, with those who are going through it. It's much easier to pity someone who's going through it and to quickly retract into your life that is mostly free from that form of pain and suffering. We all suffer, we all experience pain, but when we see the terrible intensity of pain and suffering in our world, it's understandable that we don't want to spend time there. It overwhelms us, it breaks our hearts. And I think that's precisely why we are called to identify, the same way that Christ did. The incarnation, in many ways, is God's identification with the pain and suffering of humanity, and we are called to do likewise. But again, it is a miraculous effort that requires a lot of grace, and you have to lean into it. You can't force it, but you lean into it and trust that you'll be given what you need to do it. So there are three ways: love, solidarity, promise, and then finally stewardship. Now, I know what you think of when you hear the word stewardship. We all do. Somebody's trying to raise money, give money, encourage others to give money, tell them about all the great things you're doing with the money. And that's part of it, right? It's the world we live in. You need money to pay for things and do things, of course. But what I think stewardship is really about is the equitable distribution of privilege, power, and resources. And we have to collectively figure out a way that we are going to ensure things are equitably distributed so that some aren't suffering at great expense and that others get to live at the expense of those who are suffering, right? Like we don't want to live the lives we live if it costs other people and populations terrible suffering. We don't want our lives to translate into their suffering. That is not acceptable, but that is the way of this present world. And so we are called to incarnate God's love by being good stewards of the land, of creation, and of all the resources that we have available to us to ensure that fewer and fewer and fewer people have to go about every day without basic needs. So I encourage you to think about how in particular you are being called to incarnate, how that's going to show up for you this week, how it's going to show up for the rest of this year. And I also want to promise you that you're not alone, that you're here with us, and we're all fumbling around trying to get it right, trying to do what we're called to do. So I invite you onto this adventure and onto this path, and I remind you that we're in it together. You are never alone. God goes with us always. Thanks for joining me today. See you next week.